Hey guys, tonight we step barefoot onto cool sandstone just before dawn, when the desert still pretends it's gentle and the sky holds that pale, indecisive blue between night and morning. You stand inside a Nubian sun temple, the air smelling faintly of dust, old stone, and yesterday's incense, and you're already squinting even though the sun hasn't technically shown up yet. Somewhere a bird complains about being awake too early, and you can feel that familiar sense of historical danger creeping in, the quiet realization that yes, you probably wouldn't survive this day without complaining loudly by mid-morning. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment telling everyone where you're listening from and what your local time is right now. Maybe it's midnight. Maybe it's a suspiciously productive afternoon you're pretending isn't happening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shift your weight as the stone beneath your feet slowly releases the cold it held all night. This temple, built in the ancient Nubian kingdom of Kush, south of Egypt along the Nile, is oriented with intention. That's not poetic fluff, it's architectural fact. Many Nubian temples were carefully aligned with the rising sun on particular days, especially solstices or festival mornings, when light would slide directly through doorways and corridors. Mainstream historians agree that solar observation played a practical and religious role here, guiding calendars, rituals, and the daily schedule of temple life. You're not here as a hero or explorer. You're here as a human measuring stick with opinions, tasked with watching shadows move. The courtyard opens ahead of you, flat and deliberate, etched with faint lines that look decorative until you realize they're not decoration at all. They're reference marks, guides for shadow length, direction, and angle. You can already tell this is going to be one of those jobs where time passes slowly, but somehow also sneaks up on you. A priest glides past, barefoot like you, carrying a straight wooden staff. This is a gnomon, the simplest shadow measuring tool imaginable. Stick meets sun, shadow does the math. Ancient Nubians, like their Egyptian neighbors, used gnomons to track time during the day, dividing sunlight hours based on shadow length. It's elegant in a way modern clocks can only dream of being. No ticking, no battery warnings, just the universe politely cooperating. You plant the gnomon into a small socket in the stone. Someone has already checked that it's perfectly upright, because if it leans even a little, the measurements turn into guesswork, and guesswork is how you end up missing lunch. The horizon brightens. You feel it before you see it, a subtle warming on your face. The first edge of the sun peeks over distant rock, and suddenly the temple wakes up. Shadows appear like long, quiet creatures stretching after sleep. There's a calm satisfaction in watching that first shadow fall exactly where it's expected. This is one of those moments historians love because it suggests planning, continuity, and shared knowledge across generations. The builders who placed these stones centuries ago understood the path of the sun well enough that you're now reenacting their expectations without a single written instruction. Historians still argue whether these precise alignments were driven more by religious symbolism or by practical administrative needs. But standing here, you can feel it's probably both. Humans rarely choose just one reason when they can have two. A scribe settles nearby with a wooden tablet, ready to note the time when the shadow reaches each mark. Writing in Nubia often used hieroglyphic or cursive scripts influenced by Egypt, but adapted into local forms. This is a mainstream fact that doesn't get enough attention. Nubia wasn't just copying Egypt, it was translating ideas into its own cultural language. You watch the scribe work slowly, deliberately, as if speed itself would be disrespectful. The air remains cool enough that you're comfortable, but not so cool that you forget where you are. The sun climbs higher, and the shadow shortens. You're aware of your body now, how still you're supposed to be, how movement might disrupt the reading. Your modern brain wants to check a phone. Your ancient assignment wants you to simply exist and observe. Someone mutters a quiet joke about the sun being late. It lands softly like a pebble dropped into sand. Humor exists here, just subdued, folded neatly into routine. You imagine this same joke being made hundreds of times across decades, maybe centuries, because some traditions never die, they just get better timing. There's a faint, slightly unpleasant smell drifting by. It's sunscreen, not the coconut kind. A quirky but well-attested tidbit. Ancient Nile cultures sometimes used mixtures that included animal fats and even crocodile dung as sun protection. Before you panic, no one is slathering it on enthusiastically. It's more of a symbolic dab, combined with oils and plant extracts. Still, you make a mental note to stand upwind. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. You have a feeling it'll come back later. As the sun clears the horizon fully, light floods the courtyard, illuminating carvings along the walls, gods with solar discs, stylized rays, symbols linking kingship and cosmic order. In Kushite belief, the sun wasn't just a light source, it was a participant in governance, fertility, and legitimacy. Measuring its movement was a way of maintaining harmony, or ma'at, a concept borrowed and reshaped from Egypt. You feel the shift from night logic to day logic. Tasks begin. Offerings are prepared. The shadow you're watching reaches its first official mark, and the scribe nods, recording the moment. This is timekeeping without minutes, without seconds, just intervals tied to light itself. It's surprisingly soothing, even if your calves are starting to complain. Historians still argue whether everyday Nubians understood these measurements deeply or simply trusted temple specialists to handle time on their behalf. Standing here, you suspect it didn't matter. The system worked. People ate, worked, prayed, and slept according to rhythms that matched the sky. And that consistency probably felt reassuring in a world where floods, droughts, and politics could change everything else overnight. The sun continues its climb, and the shadow shrinks obediently. You breathe slowly, matching the pace of the morning. This is only the beginning of the day, but already you sense how much patience it demands. Measuring shadows isn't about rushing toward answers. It's about waiting long enough for the answer to arrive on its own, quietly, without applause.
The sun is fully awake now. No longer easing into the sky, but climbing with quiet confidence, and you feel the courtyard change around you. The stone beneath your feet has warmed just enough to remind you that standing still all day is a bold lifestyle choice. Shadows, once long and dramatic, now begin their slow retreat, pulling themselves inward like shy animals. You keep your eyes on the gnomon, because this part of the morning matters. The angle is clean, the light sharp, and mistakes here ripple forward into the rest of the day's schedule. Rituals late, meals mistimed, mild existential chaos. A priest murmurs a low chant, not loud enough to distract, just enough to frame the moment. In Nubian temples, spoken words often accompanied observation, blending science and spirituality without much concern for separating the two. Mainstream historians agree that this wasn't confusion, it was integration. Knowing when the sun reached a certain height wasn't just useful, it was sacred. The universe was doing something predictable, and predictability was worth honoring. You shift slightly, careful not to block the light. Someone gives you a look that says, politely, "Please don't ruin astronomy." The shadow's edge creeps toward another carved line in the stone. These lines aren't evenly spaced because the sun doesn't move evenly across the sky. Ancient observers understood this intuitively, even if they didn't phrase it in modern mathematical language. Time in sunlight stretches and compresses depending on the season, and the temple's markings reflect that seasonal awareness. The scribe updates the tablet again, scratching gently, the sound barely audible. Writing materials here are modest: wood, reed pens, mineral pigments. But the knowledge being recorded is anything but. Nubian record-keeping supported temple economies, agricultural timing, and festival calendars. You're not just watching shadows, you're watching bureaucracy in its calmest possible form. Honestly, if modern offices had more sunlight and fewer emails, productivity might improve. The heat builds slowly, like a polite guest who stays longer than expected. Sweat forms at the base of your neck. You're grateful for the linen clothing, light, breathable, and absolutely unforgiving if you spill anything on it. A junior attendant offers water, and you sip carefully, knowing too much too fast is a bad idea. Hydration here is practical, not trendy. No one's bragging about it. As the shadow reaches another mark, there's a brief pause, a shared moment of satisfaction. Everything is still on track. This consistency mattered deeply in a land shaped by the Nile's flooding cycles. While Egypt often gets credit for flood-based calendars, Nubia developed its own methods for tracking seasonal change, combining river observation with solar measurement. Historians still argue whether Nubian calendars were independently developed or heavily adapted from Egyptian models, but the local adjustments are undeniable. You can see it in the temple's orientation, slightly different, tuned to this latitude, this horizon. A light breeze passes through the courtyard, stirring dust and the faint scent of resin. Somewhere, someone jokes quietly about the sun being extra enthusiastic today. It's not laugh-out-loud funny, but it earns a few relaxed exhalations. That's joke number 1 for this stretch of the day, and you're counting because boredom has a way of making you meticulous. You notice a small stone marker near the wall, shaped like an animal. Maybe a ram, maybe a lion. It's not officially part of the measuring system, but it's been there long enough that no one questions it. A quirky fringe tidbit floats through your mind. Some scholars suggest such markers served dual purposes, both decorative and mnemonic, helping apprentices remember which shadow lengths corresponded to which rituals. Others think it's just a nice stone animal that survived because nobody bothered to move it. Historians still argue whether every object in these spaces had symbolic meaning or whether some things were simply there. The sun climbs higher. Shadows grow shorter, darker, more defined. The courtyard brightens to a near-white glare, and you squint, wishing for sunglasses that will not be invented for several thousand years. Someone applies another dab of that infamous sunscreen mixture. Oils, minerals, and yes, traces of crocodile dung. It smells faintly earthy, like a swamp trying to be helpful. You remember it from earlier and silently congratulate yourself for standing far enough away. Ritual activity increases as the morning progresses. Offerings are prepared inside shaded chambers, timed according to the shadow readings you're helping maintain. This is the practical payoff. Knowing exactly when to begin, when to pause, when to transition. Time here isn't abstract, it's operational. It tells people when to sing, when to burn incense, when to open doors so sunlight can strike specific reliefs carved deep into the stone. There's a moment when the sun aligns just right, sending a narrow beam through a doorway and onto a carved solar disk inside. It's brief, precise, and undeniably intentional. Mainstream archaeology supports the idea that such light and shadow effects were engineered, not accidental. You feel a quiet thrill, the kind that doesn't demand applause. This is the payoff for all that standing still. Historians still argue whether the average temple visitor understood the astronomical mechanics behind these moments or simply experienced them as divine events. Watching the light settle exactly where it's meant to, you suspect the experience mattered more than the explanation. Knowing how something works doesn't make it less beautiful, it just adds layers. By mid-morning, your role feels automatic. Watch, wait, note, breathe. The shadow passes another mark, and the scribe records it without ceremony. Routine has taken over, and with it, a gentle sense of calm. The sun continues its steady climb, and you realize you've stopped thinking about time as something to manage
Instead, you're letting time manage you, sliding forward at the speed of light and stone, agreeing with each other. The sun has climbed high enough now that the courtyard feels less like a place of observation and more like a quiet test of endurance. Not dramatic endurance, no heroic suffering here, just the slow realization that standing, watching, and thinking all at once is its own kind of workout. You shift your shoulders, feel the linen tug, and remind yourself that this is still considered one of the easier temple duties. Somewhere, someone is hauling offerings, and suddenly, shadow watching feels like a luxury desk job. Your attention drifts briefly to the tools arranged near the wall. They are almost laughably simple: straight wooden rods, knotted ropes, small stone weights, and smooth plumb lines dangling patiently. Mainstream historians agree that Nubian and broader Nile Valley astronomers relied on these basic instruments for remarkably accurate observations. Precision here doesn't come from complexity, it comes from consistency. If you measure the same way every day for years, the sun eventually gives up all its secrets. You pick up a rope, feeling the slight roughness where hands have worn it smooth. Knots mark standard lengths used to measure the shadow from the gnomon to the etched lines on the stone. This is geometry without diagrams, math done with muscles and memory. A senior priest watches you work, offering a subtle nod that suggests you're not completely embarrassing yourself. High praise by ancient standards. There's a quiet rhythm to the process now. Shadow reaches line, rope stretches, measurement confirmed, scribe records, repeat. It's almost meditative, like breathing with extra steps. You start to understand why these roles were often lifelong positions. Once you learn to hear time and light, it probably never leaves you. A quirky tidbit surfaces as you notice a small, slightly bent gnomon set aside. It's not broken, it's intentionally curved. Some scholars think curved or angled gnomons were experimental tools, used to test seasonal variation or to compensate for uneven ground. Others think they were teaching aids for apprentices, demonstrating how even small changes affect shadow length. Historians still argue whether such variations represent innovation or simple improvisation when a straight stick wasn't available. Either way, it's comforting to know even ancient experts occasionally worked with imperfect tools. The heat is becoming assertive now, leaning into you rather than politely existing nearby. Shade edges shrink, and people migrate instinctively toward them between tasks. The temple architecture helps. Thick walls, narrow corridors, high ceilings that trap cooler air. Mainstream archaeology confirms that Nubian temples were designed not just for worship, but for climate management. You step briefly into a shaded passage and feel immediate relief, like the building itself is looking out for you. Inside, carvings depict kings making offerings to sun deities, reinforcing the idea that cosmic order and political authority are linked. In Kush, rulers often emphasize their connection to the sun to legitimize their power. Measuring the sun's movement, then, isn't just religious, it's political. You're participating in the maintenance of state ideology, one shadow at a time. No pressure. Back in the courtyard, the shadow has shortened noticeably. Midday approaches, the point where the sun seems to hover, undecided, almost smug. The measurement process becomes more delicate here. Changes are smaller, more subtle. You lean in, squinting, wishing for a ruler with millimeters. Instead, you rely on trained eyes and shared agreement. Everyone here has learned what close enough means, and it's surprisingly precise. A light joke circulates, joke number 2, about the sun refusing to move just to test everyone's patience. It earns a few smiles, mostly from people who appreciate humor that doesn't require extra energy. You file it away as proof that even in sacred spaces, mild sarcasm survives. You notice the scribe switching tablets, an indication that this set of measurements will be archived separately. Records were often organized by season or festival cycle, making it easier to compare patterns year over year. This is a mainstream fact supported by surviving Nubian inscriptions, though many records are lost or fragmented. Historians still argue how extensive these archives were and whether they included predictive models or purely observational data. The sun reaches its highest point, or close enough that everyone agrees it has. The shadow is at its shortest, hugging the base of the gnomon like it's tired of stretching. There's a brief pause in activity, a collective exhale. This moment marks more than noon. It's a hinge in the day, a reminder that everything now begins its slow return. You feel a strange affection for the tools around you. The ropes, the sticks, the marks in stone, they've outlasted generations doing the same job quietly. Modern devices will eventually do this work faster, but maybe not more gently. Measuring shadows demands patience, and patience shapes the people who practice it. As the sun begins its subtle descent, the shadow starts to lengthen again, almost imperceptibly at first. You note the change, signal the scribe, and the routine resumes. The day isn't over, it's simply turning around. And you're still here, still watching, still letting light tell you what time it is.
The afternoon settles in quietly, without announcement, like someone taking a seat and deciding not to make a fuss about it. You feel it in your knees first, then in your shoulders, then in that soft part of your brain that usually asks how long until dinner. The sun has tipped past its peak, and now the shadows begin their gradual return, stretching out again across the courtyard stones. It's familiar work by now, almost comforting, like rereading a favorite page and noticing new details anyway. You take your position beside the gnomon, eyes trained on the shadow's edge. Afternoon light is warmer, slightly softer, as if the sun has lost its earlier enthusiasm and is now just doing its job politely. Mainstream historians note that many ancient cultures divided the day into unequal hours, with afternoon hours often longer in terms of shadow movement than those near midday. You're living that reality now, watching changes happen slowly enough to invite reflection. A pair of junior priests approaches, carrying fresh ropes and smoothing out the old ones. Ropes wear down over time, stretching just enough to matter. Accuracy depends on maintenance, and maintenance depends on people who don't mind repetitive tasks. You watch them work, their movements efficient and unhurried, and you realize how much of this system relies on human consistency rather than theoretical perfection. There's a brief discussion about a discrepancy in the morning record. Nothing dramatic, just a shadow that reached its mark a fraction earlier than expected. The debate is calm, almost sleepy. Was it cloud cover? A slight lean in the gnomon? A breeze that shifted someone's stance? Historians still argue whether ancient timekeepers corrected past records retroactively or accepted small inconsistencies as part of the system. Standing here, you suspect the answer is both, depending on how much energy they had left. The scribe adjusts a previous mark with a small notation, a symbol indicating uncertainty. It's comforting to know doubt had a place in ancient records. Not everything had to be absolute. Sometimes approximately now was good enough to keep the world turning. You wander briefly to the edge of the courtyard, where a shaded bench offers relief. Sitting is allowed during certain intervals, especially in the afternoon, when the sun's movement is predictable. From here, you can still see the gnomon, still participate, just without pretending your legs are made of stone. Someone nearby shares a dried fig. It's sweet, slightly chewy, and immediately improves your outlook on history as a whole. Food, it turns out, is timeless. Mainstream evidence suggests that temple workers often ate light meals during the day, saving heavier food for evening. The logic is obvious once you've tried working in this heat. A full stomach plus sun equals regret. You take another small bite, chew slowly, and return your focus to the shadow. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts as you notice a faint chalky residue on one of the stones. Some researchers believe powdered minerals were occasionally used to highlight shadow edges during critical measurements, making them easier to see against bright stone. Others argue the residue is purely incidental, left over from ritual powders or offerings. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional visual aid or an accidental side effect of temple life. Either way, it makes your job easier, and you silently thank whoever left it there centuries ago. The afternoon routine includes recalibration. The gnomon is checked again for vertical alignment using a plumb line, because gravity, at least, is something everyone agrees on. You hold the line steady, watching it settle into perfect stillness. There's something oddly satisfying about that moment when motion stops and certainty appears. Joke number 3 slips in when someone mutters that the plumb line is the only thing here that never changes its mind. It earns a soft chuckle, the kind that barely disturbs the air. Shadows now stretch toward markings that mirror the mornings, but in reverse order. Time feels like it's folding back on itself, retracing steps with a different tone. Morning was anticipation. Afternoon is acceptance. You're no longer waiting for the day to begin. You're accompanying it toward rest. Inside the temple, preparations begin for evening rituals, all scheduled according to the measurements you're helping confirm. Doors will open at specific shadow lengths. Incense will burn when the sun reaches a particular angle. This coordination between observation and action is one of the strongest arguments historians make for the practical importance of solar tracking. It's not abstract astronomy, it's operational scheduling with religious flair. You overhear a discussion about seasonal drift, how the shadow reaches certain marks slightly earlier or later as the year progresses. This is where long-term records matter. Over decades, patterns emerge. Over centuries, calendars stabilize. Nubian priests were keen observers of these shifts, adjusting festival dates and agricultural advice accordingly. Historians still argue how precise these adjustments were and whether predictive corrections were standardized or handled locally by individual temples. The sun lowers further, and the quality of light changes again, turning golden, then amber. Carvings along the walls catch this light differently now, shadows emphasizing details that were invisible at noon. You trace a finger along a relief, feeling the shallow grooves left by ancient hands. It's a reminder that this place was built by people who also stood in this light, watching these shadows, probably wondering when they could sit down. You return fully to your station as the shadow reaches another key mark. The scribe records it, and you notice the handwriting has relaxed, less formal than in the morning. Fatigue softens precision, but it also humanizes it. These records aren't machine output. Their lived experience pressed into symbols. As afternoon deepens, the courtyard grows quieter. Some workers are dismissed, their tasks complete. A few birds return, hopping along the stones, unconcerned with solar geometry. You envy them briefly, then remember you're part of something bigger, maintaining a rhythm that aligns humans, gods, and daylight into one shared schedule. Historians still argue whether the spiritual meaning of these practices outweighed their practical utility or vice versa. Watching the shadows stretch, you suspect the question itself misses the point. In this space, meaning and utility aren't competing ideas. They're the same shadow cast by the same sun, just seen from different angles. The air cools slightly as the sun dips lower. Your body relaxes in response, muscles unclenching without being asked. The day is moving toward closure, and you feel yourself moving with it, step by slow step, shadow by lengthening shadow.
The late afternoon light feels gentler now, like it has learned some manners. You notice it first on your skin, then on the stone, then in the way everyone's movements slow without anyone needing to say so. The shadow you're tracking has grown long enough to stretch across multiple reference lines, and that means your job becomes less about precision and more about timing transitions. This is the hour when accuracy relaxes its grip just a little, and routine takes over completely. You stand near the gnomon again, but your posture is looser, your stance more forgiving. Mainstream historians point out that ancient timekeeping systems often allowed for greater flexibility later in the day, especially after critical ritual windows had passed. Morning measurements set the structure, afternoon measurements maintained flow. You're feeling that philosophy in your bones now. A priest signals that the next observation will mark the beginning of evening preparations. This is important, not because anything dramatic happens, but because it tells everyone else when to shift tasks. Fires are lit, water is drawn, doors inside the temple are unsealed in sequence. All of it depends on the sun's angle, not on a shouted command. Light leads, people follow. The shadow slides forward, its edge blurring slightly as the sun lowers. You take a rope measurement anyway, mostly for consistency. The scribe records it with a small flourish, like someone signing off on a long email chain. You glance at the tablet and recognize symbols from earlier in the day. The repetition is reassuring. This system works because it repeats. A breeze carries in cooler air from the river's direction. You close your eyes for half a second and inhale. The smell is different now. Less dust, more water, a hint of vegetation. Nubia's relationship with the Nile shaped everything, including how time was understood. Mainstream scholarship agrees that solar observation and river cycles were deeply intertwined here, each confirming the other. When shadows behaved as expected and floods arrived on time, the world felt stable. Someone nearby mentions an old story about a priest who once misread a shadow and started a festival early, only to have to gently stall everyone with extra hymns. It's told with affection, not judgment. The quirky tidbit lands softly. Mistakes were remembered, but mostly as lessons or jokes, not failures. Historians still argue how strictly errors were punished in temple contexts, but stories like this suggest patience mattered more than perfection. The sun's color deepens, and the courtyard takes on a quieter mood. Fewer people remain now, only those needed for the final observations and evening rituals. You feel oddly protective of the space, as if the day has entrusted you with its ending. You notice the chalky residue again, brighter in the slanted light. This time it clearly outlines the shadow's edge, making the measurement almost effortless. Intentional or not, it works. You mark the time and feel a small spark of satisfaction, the kind that comes from doing something simple well. Joke number 1 for this section slips out when someone remarks that the sun is finally clocking out. It earns a few tired smiles. Humor at this hour doesn't need punchlines. It just needs to acknowledge shared fatigue. Inside the temple, chants begin, low, rhythmic, paced according to the light you're tracking. This is the practical outcome of your day's work. Knowing when to begin these sounds matters. Start too early and it feels rushed. Too late and it feels like you missed the moment. The shadow reaches its mark, and right on cue, the chanting deepens. Historians still argue whether these vocal rituals were timed for acoustic reasons, cooler air, different sound travel, or purely symbolic ones tied to the sun's descent. Standing here, you suspect it's another case of both. Ancient cultures rarely separated function from meaning. The sun sinks closer to the horizon, and the shadow stretches until it nearly disappears into the stone's texture. Measurements slow, then stop. There's a final notation, a small mark indicating the day's close. The scribe sets down the tablet with care, like tucking the day into bed. You step back, muscles aching just enough to feel earned. The courtyard is bathed in warm, fading light, and the stones seem to glow from within. Birds settle along the walls. The air cools further, brushing your skin like a quiet reward for patience. You realize that measuring shadows all day hasn't felt boring in the way you expected.
It's repetitive, yes, but repetition has a rhythm, and rhythm has a way of calming the mind. You've spent hours watching something inevitable happen, and somehow that inevitability feels comforting. As the sun finally touches the horizon, you offer one last glance at the gnomon, now casting a long, soft shadow that no one needs to measure anymore. The work is done. The light has said what it needed to say, and you, for the first time all day, don't have to watch it quite so closely. Night settles over the temple without ceremony, like a blanket laid carefully so it doesn't wake anyone. You step back into the courtyard, now transformed by darkness, and notice how different it feels without the sun commanding attention. The stones that were glaring and insistent all day now absorb sound, making every footstep softer, more deliberate. Time is still here, but it's no longer something you can see, it's something you sense. Torches flicker along the walls, casting warm, uneven light that dances over carvings of gods, animals, and symbols you've traced with your eyes all afternoon. In Nubian belief, the sun didn't simply disappear at night. It traveled through a hidden realm, preparing to be reborn by morning. Mainstream historians agree that this nightly journey was a powerful metaphor for renewal, tying daily solar observation to broader ideas about life, death, and continuity. Even without shadows to measure, the sun is still very much part of the conversation. You find yourself listening to stories now. This is the hour for them. A priest speaks softly about a local sun deity, sometimes linked with the Egyptian Ra, sometimes entirely his own, who grows tired by evening and relies on human rituals to regain strength. The myth is gentle, almost domestic. Gods here aren't distant tyrants, they're participants in a shared routine. You nod, appreciating a theology that understands exhaustion. A quirky fringe tidbit slips into the storytelling. There's a belief, recorded much later, that certain shadow measurements could predict especially favorable days, when the sun's mood was particularly cooperative. Some scholars argue this reflects early attempts at divination layered onto practical observation. Others think it's simply folklore growing around an already important practice. Historians still argue whether these predictive ideas influenced official temple scheduling or remained in the realm of personal belief. You glance toward where the gnomon stands, barely visible now, its purpose paused until dawn. Someone jokes, joke number 1, that it's finally allowed to rest after working overtime. The humor is soft, affectionate, like teasing a reliable old friend. The stars begin to appear, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. You notice how different the sky looks compared to home, wider, deeper, unpolluted. There's a quiet acknowledgement that while the temple focuses on the sun, the night sky isn't ignored. Mainstream evidence suggests Nubian observers were aware of major constellations and seasonal star patterns, even if their primary timekeeping remained solar. You trace a line between stars with your finger, instinctively searching for patterns. A discussion begins about whether certain myths were tied to specific stellar events, like the heliacal rising of bright stars just before dawn. Historians still argue whether Nubian mythology encoded astronomical knowledge deliberately, or whether modern scholars are reading too much into poetic language. Sitting under this sky, you can see why the debate persists. When stars are this clear, it's hard not to imagine they're trying to tell you something. Lamps are dimmed further as people prepare to rest. The courtyard empties, leaving only a few figures moving slowly, carefully. You feel your own energy ebbing, the long day finally catching up. The jokes fade, replaced by comfortable silence. This is the reward for patience, a mind quiet enough to notice how peaceful stone and darkness can be together. You lie back briefly on a smooth slab, staring up. The air is cool, the ground steady beneath you. It occurs to you that while the day was all about measuring, the night asks for surrender. No tools, no marks, just presence. The temple feels ancient in a new way now, not busy, not purposeful, just existing. Historians still argue how much nighttime observation mattered compared to the day's careful shadow work. Some suggest nights were reserved for myth and ritual rather than measurement. Others think informal stargazing played a larger role than surviving records suggest. Either way, tonight isn't about answers, it's about rest. You close your eyes for a moment, listening to distant water, a crackling torch, someone yawning without apology. Tomorrow, before dawn, the cycle will begin again. Shadows will stretch, shorten, and stretch once more. But for now, the sun's work is finished, and yours is nearly so.
The sun's arc begins to soften again as afternoon leans toward evening, and you recognize the familiar rhythm returning, like a melody you now know well enough to hum quietly. Today's measurements are nearly complete, and the courtyard carries that end-of-shift calm where no one rushes, yet nothing is neglected. You move with an ease that wasn't there yesterday. Your feet know the stone, your eyes know the shadow. Even your impatience seems to have learned better manners. You take one last careful reading as the shadow crosses a late-day mark, its edge slightly feathered by the lower light. The scribe nods and records it, the motion so practiced it barely registers as effort. Mainstream historians note that closing measurements were often treated as confirmations rather than discoveries, checks to ensure the day behaved as expected. When it did, there was a quiet satisfaction in that normalcy. Today behaves. Everyone relaxes just a fraction. Inside the temple, evening closure rituals begin. Doors that were open to welcome sunlight earlier are now closed in a deliberate sequence. Each door has its time, tied loosely to the sun's descent. This isn't superstition, it's choreography. The building responds to the sky, and people respond to the building. You hear the soft thud of wood against stone, the muted scrape of hinges that have learned their role over centuries. A priest signals you to help carry the gnomon inside. It's lighter than you expect, which somehow makes it feel more important. You cradle it carefully, aware that this simple stick has been the axis of everyone's day. Mainstream evidence suggests that important instruments were stored securely at night, protected from moisture, animals, and casual handling. Tools that speak with the sun deserve respect, even when they're off duty. As you set it into its resting niche, you notice faint scratches along its length, records of use, not damage. Someone jokes, joke number one, that the gnomon has earned retirement at least 3 times over. The comment drifts by with a tired smile. Humor at this hour is gentle, like the light itself. The courtyard empties further. A few final tasks remain, sweeping dust from the etched lines, checking that nothing has been disturbed, smoothing the chalky residue that made measurements easier. These are small acts, but they matter. Tomorrow's accuracy depends on tonight's care. Historians still argue whether such maintenance was ritualized or simply practical housekeeping, but watching it done with quiet intention, you suspect the line between the two never mattered much. You pause near the temple wall as the sun dips lower, its color deepening into copper and gold. The carvings glow briefly, catching the light at angles that only happen now. Figures seem to move as shadows shift across them, gods walking, animals breathing, kings standing a little taller. This fleeting animation feels intentional, even if no one planned it precisely. Mainstream scholars agree that ancient artists understood how relief carvings interacted with changing light, enhancing visual impact across the day. You stand still, letting the moment pass without trying to measure it. A small group gathers near the entrance, waiting for the final signal that the day's official timekeeping is complete. The scribe steps forward, tablet in hand, and makes a concluding mark, a simple sign indicating closure. It's not dramatic, there's no announcement, just a nod,
a shared understanding. The day is logged. Historians still argue whether end-of-day records were reviewed immediately or archived first and discussed later. Either way, tonight there's no appetite for debate. The work is done. Questions can wait. You feel that deeply now. There's a point where curiosity gives way to rest, and that point arrives on schedule, guided by light rather than willpower. As twilight settles, you walk the perimeter of the courtyard one last time. Birds gather along the walls again, reclaiming the space with soft chirps. The air cools, sliding under your sleeves and along your arms. Your body responds instantly, tension loosening without being asked. Measuring shadows all day has tuned you to these subtle transitions. You notice them not as changes, but as cues. Joke number 2 arrives quietly when someone remarks that the birds seem better at timekeeping than people. It earns a soft chuckle. Honestly, they might be right. Lamps are lit inside, their glow spilling gently through doorways. Unlike the harsh noon sun, this light invites rather than demands attention. You step inside briefly, watching shadows dance across the walls again, different now, unmeasured, unofficial. Artificial light creates its own geometry, but no one records it. Night has its own rules. A fringe tidbit surfaces in conversation. Some later traditions suggest that priests occasionally compared lamplight shadows to daytime records, more as philosophical exercise than practical method. Most historians dismiss this as symbolic storytelling rather than actual practice. Historians still argue whether such stories reflect real experiments or metaphors about the limits of human control over time. You smile at the idea. Even if it never happened, it sounds like something someone would have tried just to see. The final task is simple: presence. You sit near the entrance, watching the last band of light fade from the horizon. No measurements remain, no corrections needed. The sky does what it does, indifferent yet reliable. You feel gratitude, not dramatic gratitude, just a quiet appreciation for a system that worked well enough to let people plan, gather, and rest. As darkness fully settles, the temple shifts into its nighttime hush. Voices lower, movements slow. You realize that while the day was about tracking the sun, the evening is about letting go of it. Closure here isn't an ending, it's a handoff. The sun will return, and the shadows will too, but not because you demand it, because they always have. You rise, stretch gently, and take one last look at the courtyard now swallowed by shadow. Tomorrow, those same stones will glow again, lines reappear, tools return to duty. For now, everything rests, and for the first time since dawn, you don't feel responsible for time anymore. You can simply let it pass. The darkness grows thicker, calmer, like a blanket settling just right. Your breathing slows without effort, each inhale deeper than the last, each exhale longer, smoother. The images of stone and sky drift apart, dissolving into warmth and quiet. There is nothing left to track now. Time moves on its own, steady and kind, no longer asking for attention. The temple, the sun, the shadows, they all recede into a gentle background, like sounds heard from another room. You feel supported, grounded, safe in the stillness. Muscles soften, thoughts loosen their grip. Even curiosity grows quiet, satisfied for the night. If a thought wanders through, it drifts without weight, passing like a cloud that doesn't need naming. The day is complete, the work is done. And as sleep settles in, slow and unhurried, you sink comfortably into rest, carried by rhythms older than memory, softer than light.